Okay, so this session is going to focus on ethics in social network research. I'm Jimmy Adams. I am at the University of Colorado, Denver. And yeah, so let's dive in. So what we're going to focus on today is going to derive partially from the Belmont report and kind of general foci of ethics in social research. But we're also going to focus a bit on the things that are unique to social network data and its needs for ethical considerations that differ from other standard kind of social scientific approaches. And that's going to focus largely on domains that look at consent, balancing risks and benefits, and then the ways data get used. Before we get started, I think it's worthwhile for me to give a little bit of a caveat. We're going to focus largely on sets of principles that are potentially applicable across a range of research strategies. And the reason for this is there aren't kind of universally agreed upon sets of standards that we all share. And so as a result, you'll often, it may seem as though the answers I'm giving to a variety of questions are the kind of classic "it depends," or said another way, it's often going to be the case that we're going to raise a number of questions that we're going to leave slightly unanswered. But in leaving them unanswered, I hope to demonstrate what the principles are that should be prioritized in considering how to answer such questions. A second thing that I think we'll highlight along the way is something I just mentioned briefly, is that there are few universal standards for some of the kind of topics that we're going to address today. So as a result, we'll focus at times more on examples than the kind of general rules. And occasionally we'll even raise some competing perspectives about how these approaches differ depending on your research aims, the population being studied, and other sorts of factors. And finally, we'll focus primarily on how networks are unique in that there are many aspects of social and behavioral research ethics that apply directly to network research. And then there are some aspects that need unique kind of, adaptation given the way that network data differ from other types of data. And so we're going to focus more on how these differentiations arise than we will on the kind of general principles that apply across the social sciences. As an aside, anytime I talk about ethics and networks, I always think it's kind of ironic or interesting to note one of the kind of classic small world effects in the social and behavioral sciences. We often talk about ethical standards having arisen in part as a response to experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram and by Philip Zimbardo on various kind of ways that people submitted to authority. An interesting side note that isn't always unknown about them is they actually went to the same high school and were classmates together at James Monroe High School in the Bronx. And I just find that a fascinating small tidbit that may be worth mentioning. So like I said, we're going to start from the Belmont report as a means of kind of launching our discussion today. It's not where we're going to stop. We're going to kind of draw on these kind of primary principles of autonomy, beneficence, and justice as foci for ethical considerations in social science research. But like I said, we're going to adapt these in a number of ways for the network context, and we'll interpret them a little bit. So we can think of this as kind of a baseline that we're starting from, is one way to think about this. Another place that people often start when they think about ethics in social and behavioral research is our experiences with institutional review boards or review commissions, depending on where you're coming from. But I want to note a few things about these before we proceed. And the primary of these is that their interest is in protecting the institution, not necessarily in actually protecting human subjects. And so the standards that are set by IRBs aren't always kind of all we need. And we're going to, as a result, think about some of the discussion we have today as layering on top of what IRBs propose. And other times we are going to talk about the fact that IRBs have their historical roots in biomedicine. And so the way kind of institutional review boards developed is very much focused on addressing concerns that arose from ethical dilemmas within biomedical research. So sometimes those apply to social and behavioral research, and sometimes they don't. And so you've probably already experienced, or you will in short order, the reality that IRBs often are concerned with things that seemingly aren't of concern for you in conducting your research ethically, and you'll have to figure out ways to address those. I'll also point out that IRBs are inherently local institutions. They are not there's no national standards for the way these all get applied. And so what we'll find at times in the discussion today is that the way IRB concerns get addressed is sometimes very different from institution to institution. The second thing that I want to mention with respect to IRB oversight is that it focuses on research that is concerned with human subjects. And there's a lot of research out there that doesn't actually concern human subjects, including some social network research. And so we'll talk briefly about kind of the times where these standards we can be exempt from them, but we'll also focus largely on research that is kind of in the domain of human subjects. And like I said, we're going to think about the IRB as setting a set of minimum standards, and we're going to talk about ways that we often need to go above and beyond those. So where I'm going to start is with the notion of autonomy that comes from the Belmont report, and autonomy often gets primarily highlighted, although there are some other dimensions, but it primarily gets highlighted in the notion of what gets termed informed consent. And here we have kind of classic definition of informed consent as is on a number of pages at the National Institutes of Health websites, where informed consent entails a number of dimensions. The key ones that are often highlighted out of a definition like this are that participation in research is voluntary. We can't force people to do research, and it's voluntary kind of the whole way through, meaning that if people start, they can stop at any time. They provide this consent prior to participation is a second detail of informed consent. It's not something that happens kind of after the fact in human subjects research. And we could talk about a variety of ways that this has either been violated historically or adapted to particular needs in particular study designs. Informed, meaning that we need to know kind of the full potential risks and the full potential benefits, and kind of what the research is going to entail is thought to be a necessity of informed consent. There are obviously ways in which research sometimes adapts this as well in terms of deception and things like that. There are ways that gets addressed. That's going to be beyond our purview mostly here, but we're just going to focus on the fact that it entails a knowledge of what the study includes, particularly focusing on its potential risks and benefits. A fourth dimension of informed consent that is also highly central to this definition is that this consent is somehow documented, often with signed forms of various sorts. And each one of these can actually have some implications that are different for network research than is so for other types of social and behavioral research. And so we're going to raise in some of the subsequent slides the ways that these necessitate some adaptations for that unique kind of flavor. So consent, if we're thinking about it, often is conceptualized as an individual process, right, where people are voluntarily signing up to or participating in research on their own behalf. They're saying, I am willingly giving you my information or my participation. But networks are fundamentally relational in nature, and so there are going to be some ways that this gets changed. And one of the ways that it's going to kind of change from the outset is we're going to ask the question of kind of for whom are we eliciting consent when we're conducting network research? If we have this kind of example of an ego network where the person in the center labeled E is connected to these about a dozen or so people, who needs to provide consent becomes a question that is different in this context, because there are 13 people involved in these in the data represented here, not just the one in the middle. And if that's the case, from whom do we need to elicit consent? Well, the answer to that is not that straightforward, and it becomes even more complicated when we recognize that often we aren't just kind of enumerating one's friends or one's contacts or one's relationships of various sorts, but we're also often eliciting information in the form of name interpreter or relational interpreter questions about those people and about those relationships. So our focus in network research often entails gathering information about people other than those who are providing that information. So we need to then ask the question of, do we need consent for each one of these people? And this is kind of that representation, like I was saying, of in addition to the individual providing the information and then the individuals about whom they're providing information, we can have what have come to be known as relational interpreters, where we're looking at kind of who's connected to whom amongst one's alter set. And if that's the case, then who's consenting to these is an entirely separate question, because these relationships don't inherently belong to anyone. They belong to, at minimum, two different people. And so if that's the case, then consent as a foundationally kind of individual orientation doesn't really fit the nature of the types of data we collect in the network context. And so we could then ask the question of, are these people informed, and is their participation voluntary, and can we document these things prior to their participation in study, becomes a complicated set of factors for those who are not directly participating or who are not directly providing the information as we gather it. So we're going to ask this as a question of, like, where does consent need to come from? And the first and simplest answer to this is in the context of ego networks, where when we are collecting ego networks, we do not need to elicit identifying information about the partners we get information about. So for example, the classic personal network name generator in the General Social Survey doesn't need us to provide uniquely identifying information. In fact, right there in the prompt, it says you can just give first names or even initials, so that we don't have uniquely identifying information even from the outset, right? So one way that we deal with this relational kind of need for consent is that we think about the network as about an individual and the people they're connected to, but we don't collect information that is fully identifying about those individuals they're connected to. And so the way around kind of needing consent for all of those 13 people in the previous slide is the other 12 people are not uniquely identifiable in a way that it necessitates consent from them. So this becomes, I won't say simple, but a relatively straightforward way of dealing with the consent problems. Some IRBs have even had difficulty with this level of information, that you are reporting information about people who haven't provided their voluntary assent to be included. But it's usually relatively easily negotiable with IRBs to get past this by recognizing that we aren't going to have them in any identifiable form. And so therefore it's anonymized data, which is a relatively standard exemption for most IRB considerations. And this can even, I just want to point out that data that are collected in this way can even be used to provide kind of relational interpreters of the sort that I was talking about. This comes from an example of research I was involved in Malawi a little over a decade ago, where we asked about people who people talk to about HIV related matters, and those network partners that they named can be provided initials or nicknames that they can, as long as they can remember who they were referring to, we can then ask how well those people know each other, how frequently they interact, and so forth and so on. So it doesn't diminish our capacity to collect information of the flavor that we're used to in the kind of ego network context that you've heard about in more detail elsewhere in this workshop. But the basic premise that I'm going to kind of build upon as we go further is that as we shift to non-ego networks, it makes the notion of individual consent protocols fundamentally problematic, and we're going to need to be able to think about these in somehow different ways. I will note that there are even ways that ego network designs kind of thinking in consent as a foundationally individual property is somewhat problematic as well, but we'll focus largely in the kind of more complete or linked trace-based designs for most of this discussion. So the first and kind of most kind of foundational aspect of why consent is different in the network context is that relationships themselves don't inherently belong to any one person, right? They belong to multiple people involved in the relationship. And this leads to a variety of things that, a variety of potential kind of problems that we're going to address, or solutions to those problems. The first is kind of who gets included or excluded from research coverage. And we'll talk about different strategies that are used for that. There's a bit of a catch-22 in kind of eliciting consent that we'll talk about. And then there also is the notion that participants and subjects, research subjects, sometimes have different concerns about what is ethical or what should be allowable than do researchers or IRBs, or even what the primary concerns are in the Belmont report. So we're going to also address some of those along the way, and recognize that these are somehow often different in a network context than they are in some of the more individually or population-oriented research that social and behavioral scientists are often more used to. So second thing we're going to kind of focus on as we dive more into consent is thinking about procedural protections and adaptations that allow us to address some of these concerns or other concerns that may arise via just, ethical considerations or IRBs, unfamiliarity with network research in ways that necessitate some additional strategies to alleviate those concerns. So I'll get into each one of these in more detail in the coming slides. So the first thing I want to talk about is this notion of how we elicit consent and how this impacts inclusion in the research itself. And I'm going to do this primarily through an example that comes from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, or AdHealth, that had a two-stage consent process that worked differently in different school districts. So I think it's a useful illustration because different standards can be necessitated by different governing boards, whether it's your institution where you're conducting the research, where the places you want to conduct that research, like in the context of schools or school districts in this case, or what individual participants might desire as well. So at the broadest level, what AdHealth required was that they provided parental consent for participation and inclusion in what ultimately became a directory of each of the schools they studied, which was then converted into a roster that was used for eliciting nominations in the friendship and romantic ties in those schools. The way parental consent was elicited happened two different ways depending on the school district. So the default was what can be referred to as a passive or an opt-out inclusion strategy. And basically the way this operated in AdHealth was a flyer or card went out to all of the parents of all the students in every one of the schools that notified them that AdHealth was coming. They told them about the kind of basic premises of the study design, and they told them the types of things that they were going to be asking their kids. And then they provided a card that allowed them to refuse their kids' participation in this study. So if they refused, then that student would be excluded. This is what is known as assent, this kind of passive opt-out strategy, in that if a card wasn't received, then it was assumed that the parents that the parents consented to their kids' participation in the study. So this is why it's referred to as passive, because if nothing happens, then consent is assumed to have been provided, and that's the kind of opt-out nature of the study. The alternative that was required by a number of the school districts, I don't remember how many, but it was required by a number of the school districts that AdHealth studied in the initial waves, was what gets referred to as an active or an opt-in inclusion requirement, where the same kind of announcement went out, but cards had to come back that allowed for the students' inclusion in the study. And when I say inclusion in the study, this means that if they did not get a card back in these active opt-in studies, active opt-in school districts, then those students were not able to be included in this kind of dummy version of the student roster that you see on the upper right-hand side. So this means that students couldn't be nominated as a potential friend or potential romantic partner in the study, even though they were members of the school that was being examined. So these lead to really different criteria for who is in the study, both in terms of respondents and who is in the study in terms of who can potentially be reported as a partner in the study. If you haven't seen the AdHealth data collection instrument per se, it was a Scantron type of instrument where students were asked to fill in bubbles that corresponded to the IDs for their partners for both friendship and romantic ties. And the Scantron happened for friends happened in school, and then in the in-home, they had both friend and romantic tie nominations. So the kind of caveat here is a couple of things. First is, like I said, to be included in the roster, the passive design meant that they had to not receive a refusal card. For the active schools, it meant that in order to be included in the roster, they had to receive an inclusion consent. So that's how students either became on the roster or were left off of the roster. But just inclusion in the roster doesn't necessarily mean that the students themselves would be participating in the study, because students could refuse themselves even if their parents gave consent, passively or actively. They might be absent on the day of data collection and not be kind of reached via follow-up, or any number of other reasons. They may be on the roster, but not be participants. And so I'm just pointing out some of the kind of ramifications of this that have kind of far reaching. They can be named by anyone if they're on the roster, but some have more limited reach in that students may not be participants even if they are on that roster. There's kind of a second stage of protection that was particularly well developed for the AdHealth study. And I'll just mention as an aside that if you're ever curious, the kind of political history of AdHealth actually making it into the field is quite robust. It was basically shut down at one point in time, and then kind of relaunched later with some added with some substantial changes to the design and some added protections. And a few of those protections lead to the ways that data are stored as a means of additional protection for kind of maintaining this consent, providing the information about what the study is going to entail and what those risks look like. We'll get to risks and benefits later, but just since we're talking about AdHealth now, I just wanted to kind of run with AdHealth for a minute and talk about some of the additional protections that they provided. So one thing that they do is that the respondent IDs, as were used to collect the data, were separated from the rest of the data, and then they were shipped to a storage facility in Canada, and there's no kind of means to put them back together with the data that are on location, even in North Carolina, with the kind of raw, quote unquote, raw version of the data, in that there are a variety of components of these data that are self-contained, and that kind of respondent ID linkage is not possible after they have been separated. And so this is one of the ways that these data are kind of have additional protections embedded within them. And then an additional layer that is meant to minimize risks and particularly meant to minimize risks is that the access to AdHealth data is very multi-tiered, and that there are kind of different levels of data access that people can have. There's what are known as the public use data. In terms of network applications, there are summary statistics for each schools that have been computed, I think by Jim Moody and some of his other collaborators, that are available in these public use data. But there are more kind of granular data in the network context that are available in other kind of tiers of access. There's what is known as restricted use data that is kind of available on particular types of computers at particular locations via data use agreements. And this is where you can get access to the friendship networks. And like we have that at Boulder, for example. There is then what is known as the high security restricted data. And this is data that you have to actually go to a cold room in North Carolina to get access to. And this is where the actual romantic partner nomination data in AdHealth reside. There are other types, I have other types of data that don't have network data in them, but I think it's worth pointing out that the romantic tie data are amongst the most highly protected data in ad health, and that you can get access via local secure data facilities to things like geocoded information and transcript data that you can in kind of secure data facilities at various places across the country that do have kind of higher restrictions than restricted use data, but they're less restrictive than this high security restricted data that requires you essentially to go to North Carolina to use. So that to say, the romantic tie data in ad health are amongst the most protected data that they have. Similarly, the GWAS or genetic data are available via a central repository that is maintained by the National Institutes of Health. So all this to say that the ad health study went to great lengths, both to kind of generate a consent procedure that was protective of identification of the respondents in the study, and allowed them to know what the potential risks were, and then in addition, maintained particular strategies of data de-identification and of data segmentation that helped to bolster those protections even further. I just think it's a very useful example for a complex data structure that is highly attuned to these considerations that we're talking about today. This is a bit of an aside that's kind of tangential to our purposes of a focus on ethics here, but I do want to mention that different inclusion and exclusion criteria can lead to alterations in the characteristics of the observed network. So here's an example from a paper by Krista Geil and Mark Hancock, where you have a kind of quote unquote ground truth example of network data on the left. And then if we only include respondents in that data, you see some ties that get dropped and some nodes that get dropped as we move to the right-hand side. So who gets included in the data can lead to differences in structure of the networks as they are observed, is what I want you to take away from this. There's been a lot of research out there on these types of questions, and generally this research finds that local features like network composition or homophily, et cetera, are more robust to these exclusion criteria than are global features like distance or reachability that can be more readily altered by relatively kind of minor relatively few drops of nodes and or ties that depend on how inclusion or exclusion criteria allow for various bits of data to be in the study. So the kind of punchline here, though, is that the implications of these vary substantially by the types of ties that you're interested in, the design decisions, networks kind of density or sparsity, right? So sparse networks are going to be more impacted by individual nodes or ties not being allowed for inclusion, et cetera. So all this to say, there's no kind of singular answer of what the implications are going to look like, other than that kind of local features are slightly more robust, global features are slightly less robust, but you're going to see differential impacts on these sorts of decisions and implications of ethical considerations that apply across study designs, study types, locales, et cetera. So where I'd like to kind of move to next is thinking about the question of whether or not we want to think of alters, those nominated partners of respondents in studies, as human subjects. And this might seem like an odd question, but there are a variety of reasons that it's not as straightforward as you might assume. Yes, they're people, and yes, there's information being provided about them, but there are a number of reasons that we might think of the human subjects protections that we have come to know quite well as not necessarily applying to these alters. The first reason would be that we can both generate our data in such a way and maintain our data in such a way that allows them to be facing minimal risks, in which case, as many research designs that are exempt have found, if we have kind of what get defined as minimal risks, then it doesn't necessitate many of the other protections that we might implement in kind of ethical protection considerations. So I'll like to say, if we can collect data in such a way that maintains minimal risks, the human subjects protections might not be necessary. A second way that the kind of human subjects protections have been, the potential for a lack of necessity of human subjects protections have been raised, is thinking about the fact that the data that are being collected when I report on my partners and their characteristics and the relationships they have, is that that's my perception of their characteristics and my perception of their relationships, rather than the reality of those alters characteristics and relationships. Now, this might feel a little squishy, but there are reasons that this might be a useful distinction to make, and has been made even in relatively high, quote unquote, high risk context. And the Klovedahl et al. Piece in the 2005 special issue of Social Networks on this, just Klovedahl piece on this is actually about HIV risk. And so making that argument in that context is a relatively highly kind of protected subject matter that I think is worth noting. This parallels research distinction sometimes between what get referred to as respondents versus research that entails what are known as informants from people who are known as informants. Respondents are providing data about themselves and about individuals, whereas informants are thought to be providing information about a population as a whole. This also then leads to considerations about what are known about topics of identifiability that we'll touch on later, about kind of differences between confidentiality and anonymity. The final thing that I want to raise is that these aren't, even though we might think of these as concerns that are unique to network research, they aren't. For example, demographers have been working for decades on what are known as kind of household roster, household listing techniques, where they go out and they ask for information about all the members of the household and then information about each one of them individually. And so this is a kind of robust literature on what are known as secondary subjects. So while we might use the term alters are just a unique type of secondary subject. And the literature on secondary subjects has provided kind of justifications for many of these kind of minimal risk perception and identifiability considerations that allow for elicitation of information about them that elides the necessity of getting informed consent from these secondary subjects. You might think that another way to say this is that human subjects protections often are only thought to apply to the primary subjects, those providing the information for each of these reasons. And there's a robust literature on a variety of these topics out there, mostly outside of a network context. So the kind of an additional layer of complexity of obtaining consent in a network context is for research designs that are known as kind of link tracing or partial or kind of sampling, respondent-driven sampling types of approaches to studying a network context. And that is when we don't have a full population enumerated, but we start out with some seeds in this visualization at the bottom. Those seeds are labeled as triangles. And then from those seeds, they tell you something about their partners. And then we try and recruit from those partners as additional respondents in the study. And so these types of recruitment, referral-based, link tracing-based designs could lead to a strict, if you were following a strict interpretation of consent requirements, it could lead to a catch-22 where we couldn't gather information about anyone from whom we don't already have consent, but at the same time, we don't know who to request consent from before information is provided about them or their relationships. So if all we have are the seeds, if we were following a strict consent requirement, we might not be able to ask them about any of their partners without getting consent from them first, but we don't know to get consent from them without knowing who those partners are. So this leads us to kind of a place of being stuck. The good news is there are strategies that are available for trying to kind of address these concerns. The first are a strategy that has been kind of most robustly developed in the respondent-driven sampling literature, but it exists in a variety of other study designs as well. This is from a study by Jimi Trinitopoulos, Sarah Yeatman, and some of their colleagues in Malawi, where basically they're doing a partner-based sample where they have women who have come into their research subject, and then they wanted to also their research project, and they have also wanted to recruit some sample of their romantic partners. And so they basically send them home with this token. This is an index card that number 7 in the blanks you see there get recorded as a unique identifier of the potential partner that then the respondent takes home, gives to their partner, and then that partner comes in on their own accord. So we don't necessarily know who those people are until they consent by showing up to participate themselves. So these kind of tokens or referral chains that are elicited from the respondents themselves is one of the ways to get around that catch-22. Another, and I think particularly clever way to get around this is to not to have a population that is identifiable, but to not need to identify in a uniquely identifying way who those partners are that are being nominated. And this is what Kirk Dombrowski and some of his colleagues referred to as a Telefunken approach. And basically what they did is they took mobile phone numbers and asked people whether the last 3 digits of those were even or odd, or low or high, being above or below 4.5. And then they combined this with a set of easily observable characteristics approximating kind of height, weight, hair color, eye color, gender, and race ethnicity, which then is converted into a 6-bit code for each respondent that allows them to match the respondent to the contacts that are reported by other study respondents by them providing this kind of same Telefunken code for their partners. And the paper that is listed at the bottom kind of shows their strategy for doing this, and then kind of the inferential kind of ability to match across nominations. And what's particularly kind of clever about this is that this Telefunken encoding ensures that the actual identities of respondents remain unknown to the researchers throughout the study. And so there's no need to have identifying information. The identifying information the respondents have themselves, but they're not providing it to the researchers in any way. And so this elides that necessity of the catch-22 that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So I'm going to shift gears a bit now. We've touched on some of these kind of risk-benefit trade-offs already, but we're going to focus on them more explicitly now. The 2 kind of primary ways that the Belmont report moves on from consent is to talk about beneficence, or the kind of capacity to not do harm, and counterbalancing that against potential benefits. And then a third factor of justice, of kind of who receives the benefits versus who bears the risks of research. Often in social behavioral research, we kind of think of these 2 things as interrelated and not fully separable from one another. So I'm going to combine them for our purposes. And so, like I said, this leads to a kind of trade-off between minimizing risks and maximizing benefits. It also leads to a focus on protecting potentially personally identifying information, which we touched on with AdHealth, but we're going to elaborate a little bit further in some kind of definitional terms as we continue. And it also leads to the implication of avoiding deductive disclosure, which has some unique features for network research in particular. So I'm not going to talk too much more about minimizing and maximizing benefits, minimizing risk and maximizing benefits, because that's not particularly different in the network context. But we'll think about some of these other factors as we move forward. So privacy is obviously a consideration for any research, but we can think of privacy as essentially protecting an individual's kind of capacity to participate in such a way that the things that they're disclosing are known to be disclosed by them. So things that they think are private are being maintained as private, but we can also recognize that we are often collecting information about things that there's no reason to assume are private. Public interactions, for example, has no kind of assumed privacy to it. And so the way that data are potentially available in that context differ from data that are assumed to be private. Now, data that are assumed to be private can be collected in either anonymous or confidential ways. Anonymous data collection is defined as data that are not collected about a person in identifiable ways, right? So the basic idea here is that the data never even collect information that is uniquely identifying about individuals in their participation. So in a network context, this is possible in an ego network, in ego network design, but we've already talked about the fact that it's not really kind of viable in a complete network design. And so we're more often living in the space of kind of confidential data. And what we mean by confidential is that while identifiable information is collected, it is not reported in such a way that allows those respondents to be identifiable, whether that's in kind of tables, whether that's in publicly available data sources, or whether that is in the way that participation is kind of known. And so confidentiality has a variety of kind of protections that are necessary in terms that we've already been talking about like keeping identifying information separate from non-identifying information, masking that in certain ways, so forth and so on. So the punchline here is that confidentiality is where most social network research lives, in the few exceptions that allow for anonymous data collection. That's a separate standard, but confidentiality is more commonly the standard applied. So the question then becomes, if we're trying to maintain confidentiality, what is personally identifying information? Generally, this gets defined as a variety of characteristics, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about these, but I think it's worth noting that it's well above and beyond the kind of directly identifying information of things like name and address or genetic information. But there are things like the level of abstraction or aggregation about a person. So maybe instead of recording an address, you record their census block group or their census tract or something, even a higher level of aggregation. Highly precise information often can be identifiable in particular ways. So one way you can do this is, instead of kind of the specific date someone was born, you might record their age. And if you record their age from that, then you don't know exactly kind of when, you can't even infer when they were directly when they were born, if you don't also have kind of the precision of when an interview was conducted, et cetera. So all this is, the point here is that kind of highly precise information can be obfuscated in certain ways that allows it to be less identifying than if you kind of keep the specificity with which it was reported in the kind of recorded version of the data. Another version of kind of identifiable are things that are potentially linkable to other data sources, whether kind of number 4 is talking about kind of external sources, or number 5 is talking about internal sources to the research itself. So the other thing that is particularly worthwhile to recognize is that combinations of characteristics can lead to individuals being uniquely identifiable in public data, and even in public data sets. And it might be a smaller number of variables than you might think. There is a robust literature on this in kind of computer science that talks about kind of the re-identifiability of data and how few variables are needed to be able to do this. And so this can lead you to recognizing the things that might need to be obfuscated in various ways through aggregation, or some people even introduce noise into data in certain contexts, in order to maintain these kind of protections that come with the need to remove or protect personally identifying information. It's also worth noting that there are kind of strategies for maintaining this that are more explicit. Like in the United States, there are certificates of confidentiality that can protect the researcher against the need to disclose these things, even against things like legal claims. There are strategies that we've already talked about for data disaggregation and separation of storage that can help to maintain these kind of protections against PII being released as well. The final thing that I'll mention isn't something we've talked about before, and that is that even in the context of kind of all of these protections, it's possible the data could be used in such a way that could re-identify participants. And so a very important strategy that is available is before releasing data to potential kind of others who might use it, is having data use agreements that restrict the way the data can be used, and in particular restrict it in ways that requires them to say that they're not going to use it to re-identify any of the individuals in the research. And so these data use agreements become an additional layer of protection that I think is particularly useful, especially as we increasingly see a move towards open science practices of data sharing, et cetera. So what constitutes personally identifying information in a network context is actually additionally kind of different, because you can recognize that there are particular positions in networks that are uniquely identifiable. This is the classic karate club study. And there are two people who are often, the kind of story gets told about why the club split, become their kind of labels, their labels matter, but labels could matter in any variety of contexts, right? So particularly kind of bridging individuals, or individuals have particularly kind of unique positions in a network, become rapidly identifiable in our kind of penchant for presenting networks with visualizations in our research. And so you have to think about whether or not those individuals are identifiable in unique ways. But moreover, in a network context, if individuals are identifiable, then the people those individuals are connected to become identifiable, can become identifiable in ways that this kind of this re-identifiability can kind of quickly unravel in ways that is not immediately apparent always. And so you'll want to be careful in considering whether or not the presentation of a network visual might be something that leads to revealing personally identifying information in ways that is kind of unintentional. And so this is kind of this connected version of PII, that my personally identifying information might be related to whether or not your information is identifiable in a network context in ways that they're kind of more separable in other social and behavioral science research. Another way that we need to think about PII is that personally identifying information is also a collective property. It's not just an individual property. So there's a classic study of the taste, ties, and time study that was conducted on Facebook by Kevin Lewis and Nicholas Christakis and some of their collaborators. And it became rapidly apparent that kind of the quote unquote masking of the location of the research that was done there was not sufficient to kind of hide where the research was done. And this is a paper that was published shortly thereafter on just the metadata of kind of the characteristics of the population led it to be very simple, very easily identifiable of where that population was located. And so these kind of collective properties of identifying information also are important to protect as we address ethical considerations for all research, not just network research. So the last thing I want to talk about is that the uses to which network data are put also often raises unique considerations in ways that I think we need to address as well. So the first is going to be the difference between kind of explanatory aims and predictive aims. And the reason I want to raise this is that social network research is largely predicated on explaining things, looking backwards in time, and our predictive kind of success is substantially less. This matters for a variety of reasons, but if our data are intended to predict, to be frank, we are less successful at that than we are at explaining. And this is particularly true if we also consider that our predictions and interventions are more successful at the population level than they are at predicting at the individual level. So our predictions and interventions often only work for individuals on average, but not for any individual with high precision. And so if this is the case, if we're thinking about interventions or predictions that might have implications for benefits like job hiring and firing and promotion, or interventions that might be particularly advantageous to individuals, we need to recognize that the ethical implications of those are often outstripping our predictive capacity in a social network context. And we don't want to kind of overstep in what we propose to be able to do. A second thing that is worth raising with respect to this for our purposes here today is the notion of kind of who owns the data that we collect. And I highlight from a special issue of Social Networks in 2005, two particular papers by Steve Borgatti and Jose Luis Molina in one paper, and then Charles Kadushin in another, that provide a set of standards for how they engage in organizational research. Since network research often, there's a lot more organizational research in networks than in some other kind of fields, how they deal with the notion of kind of whose data are these? Because we often do want to report back what we find in our studies, but at what level of aggregation and at what level of precision we want to do that is something that is often going to need to be negotiated. Kadushin even proposes having kind of an explicit contract about what he will and will not provide to the organization, whereas Borgatti and Molina's piece actually has a contract where they are by participating in the research, they're explicitly noting that they're going to provide some level of detail back to the organization, and so letting individuals in the study know that that's going to happen. The point here is that the informed consent needs to take place in such a way that the types of decisions and types of uses that the data could be put to need to be explicit from the outset, and you should have a conscious decision of how that control is maintained. Because in organizational contexts like Ron Burt's types of research, right, there are kind of all kinds of outcomes that are associated with network position that could be used to be informed on these in strategies that I think are important to be cognizant of. And I'm just going to talk about this really briefly. Kieran Healy posted a kind of tongue-in-cheek story to Slate a number of years ago, where he basically said that if we do kind of a data analysis of only the metadata of kind of who attends a variety of events in the kind of the revolutionary period in the United States, you would have been able to pick out either Paul Revere or one other person as a potential kind of linchpin in that era, as someone who could have been targeted. And the reason this arose at the time was this was at the time of the Edward Snowden kind of disclosures, and people were saying, well, if it's only metadata, what does it matter? And the point was that metadata can be particularly kind of revealing when it's got high granularity for a variety of events, to the point that these types of kind of analyses were used in finding Saddam Hussein and other kind of terrorist infiltration sorts of sources as well. And if you have the time, even if you don't have the time, I would suggest searching the archives of the SocialNet listserv, where there have at various times bubbled up pretty substantial debates about types of analyses that network researchers should be willing to engage in. And there are highly conflicting views on this. The point here is that knowing how data could be used and the analyses of those data could be used is something that network researchers should be aware of from the outset. So this is not just, these ethical considerations are not just about the data collection itself, but about the uses to which the data might be applied as well. I think this is particularly important in an era of increasing kind of data accessibility. So as we kind of move towards efforts of more kind of open methods and open data, the kind of secondary uses of scholarly data for kind of repurposing for other sources necessitates a reinterpretation of informed consent, because one of the standards that has often been applied to informed consent is that people should know what the analyses of the data are going to be. And as we increasingly see data made publicly available, we're seeing the uses expand, and this often kind of doesn't follow the traditional standards of informed consent. So something we need to reconsider. And as we also see the kind of influx of quote unquote big data or unintended data, things that were collected for non-research purposes, but are being kind of used for data for research purposes, it raises the questions of kind of how all of these standards we've been talking about apply to data that weren't collected with these standards. And so we need to evaluate things that we should do with such data, not just the things that we can do with such data. Just because it's available doesn't make it kind of free game for any types of questions. So just a few kind of additional considerations that I think are worth mentioning briefly. There has been increasing volume of participatory research and cognitive interviewing approaches that ask research participants themselves, kind of what they perceive to be acceptable practices. I mean, I think this is a really rich literature for us to visit and revisit at a number of times as we kind of continue to address some of the questions that we've raised here today. The proper level to obtain consent is a recently opened conversation that there are people who are now proposing what is known as kind of collective consent instead of individual or informed consent, that draws on strategies that are adapted from ethnographic and other types of research. That I think is an interesting conversation, but I don't think it's advanced enough to really have many conclusions to it yet. As we've said at various times today, there really aren't existing universal standards for many of the topics we've raised today. In fact, in a special issue of Social Networks that's cited here at the bottom by Tabarro et al., they describe the field as kind of a fragmented and fuzzy ethical landscape. So I just want to kind of reiterate that this is the case. I'm not kind of just being wishy-washy on the recommendations I want to make. It's that there are conflicting and sometimes localized standards that exist out there. As we increasingly kind of incorporate breadcrumb, big and public data sources, is going to lead us to need to kind of rethink some of these things. I mean, as I said in the previous slide, just because these data are available doesn't make all of their uses fair game. And the last thing I want to say with respect to these kind of additional considerations is that IRBs fundamentally only set minimum standards. We often need to rise above those. And I'll draw on something that Tabarro et al. Said, that they claim they call for a more reflexive approach to ethics in S&A research than I think is currently practiced. And I think this is a really useful way to think about where we stand at the moment in the field. So kind of a parting thought for us and a budding initiative is an aside that I made, a side comment that I made in my book on network data collection, was that currently one of the reasons we don't have kind of a collective standard is that social network research is fundamentally multi and interdisciplinary in a variety of ways. So there's kind of no inherent organization to take the lead in developing a shared set of ethical standards. And I mused that maybe INSNA and the Network Science Society might come together in ways to support such an effort at the time. And I didn't really think much about it for a couple of years. But then I opened a conversation with Laura Keeley recently, and there's a fledgling move afoot towards thinking about trying to coordinate something between these two societies to develop a set of standards. That the main reason for this would be that often this kind of notion that I raised earlier, that we're often left to kind of negotiate with our local IRBs, their kind of discomfort with and unfamiliarity with network research, kind of training them in how to approve network research often becomes kind of an institution by institution problem. And so if that's the case, then maybe a combined set of standards would be something that we could have, that we could take to those boards and say, hey, here's kind of best practices as agreed upon by both of these societies. We'll see where that goes, but it's something that is in the kind of works tentatively currently. And I'll just mention that there are a variety of additional resources that are available out there that dive much deeper into most of these topics. In my book on gathering social network data, the structure of what we talked about today is largely there in chapter 4, and there have been special issues of the journal Social Networks in 2005 and in 2021, and a variety of other sources that are available out there, but I'll point you to these in particular. So I want to thank you for your time and look forward to the Q&A that we will have. Thank you very much.